Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited to see all of you. We're looking forward to this MIT Club event, which will be a panel on developing executive presence. Several of us got together and we just wanted to have a forum where we could talk about career topics and challenges and then learn from each other and grow. And that's what led to this kickoff event. We're hoping that there will be many more events like this to come in the future. Now, this event is about developing executive presence for women's careers. At the same time, we welcome anybody who would like to attend and then participate in this discussion. Some housekeeping items: we will be recording the actual panel event once it starts. We will stop when the panel is over, when it's time for Q&A, so please feel free to ask whatever you want at that time. We do want to batch up the questions for the end of the panel. Feel free to either type your questions directly into the chat, or if you want to ask them anonymously, you can send them over to me and then I will ask them on your behalf. Maybe I'll rename myself to Q&A so you can find me in the chat list. All right, so let's get started. You are going to hear today from an amazing, very accomplished group of women executives. We're so grateful that they have come together and given their time, their energy, and they have such a genuine desire to help all of us grow. To get this started, I would like to introduce you to Grace Colon. She has an impressive career in the biotech industry, been a CEO, venture capitalist, board member, advisor, and that's just scratching the surface. Grace, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody?
Thanks, Shalene. I am so excited to be here today. I love the MIT Club of Northern California. As many people who know me know that I'm a super proud MIT alum. Did my PhD there in chemical engineering, finished a long time ago, back in 1995. And I'm super excited to be here today with an amazing group of fellow MIT grads, and we'll learn all about their backgrounds in a few minutes. I wanted to give you a little bit about my background. So when I finished my PhD at MIT, I went on, did some consulting for a few years with McKinsey. And then I've had a really fortunate good luck to be able to work at a number of different companies and settings, all in biotech and healthcare. Spent some time at Affymetrix during the genomics, early days of the genomics revolution. Spent some time at Gilead Sciences in a variety of corporate commercial and R&D roles. And then the last sort of 10, 12 years, I've been in a number of startups and as a venture capitalist, investing in companies, leading companies, starting a couple of companies. And currently, I am CEO of Nkarta Therapeutics, where we're developing groundbreaking therapy for atrial fibrillation. And I sit on a couple of boards involved in the diagnostics area. I also spend quite a bit of time on diversity initiatives and mentoring and getting women and underrepresented groups on boards and in C-level positions, and happy to talk to any of you at any time. Please feel free to reach out. Happy to talk about entrepreneurship or any of those topics. So without further ado, let me do a couple of things. The way we're going to do this event today is I have a short presentation, a bit of an overview on executive presence, what it is, why it's important, and some quick tips. And then we're going to go into a panel discussion with our esteemed panel where we have a number of questions that we're going to be discussing. Throughout it all, if you have questions, as Shalene mentioned, please put them in the chat and we'll gather after we've had a bit of a moderated discussion. We're going to gather the questions and ask them with the whole group. And then we're going to have, depending on time, either 1 or 2 breakout sessions of about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on time, where we can have smaller, more informal discussions amidst the group. We can talk about, share anecdotes, examples, anything you've learned, anything you want to share. So we can just have a casual conversation. And then we're going to come back at the end with a wrap up, and maybe some of the breakout sessions may have generated some additional topics or questions. So we're going to play it a little bit by ear, depending on the length of the discussion and questions. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, tell you their names and titles. We're going to go through the presentation, then we're going to go back, and I would love for each of them to talk a little bit more about their careers and their backgrounds, and then we're going to go into questions. So we have Andrea Leswick, who's Chief Operating Officer of Technology at Salesforce. Parul Samani, who's founder and CEO of Silver Linings, and Dingley Graham, who's principal liquid assets at New Island Capital Management. And they're all MIT grads and have exciting career stories that we're going to be sharing in a minute. But first, I'm going to share a short presentation. And by the way, if anybody is interested in getting a copy of this, we can certainly provide a copy. It's quite short, but it's just really meant to stimulate some discussion. Oops. So we talked about the panelists today. Wanted to talk a little bit about what do we mean when we talk about executive presence. And when you see people like Ursula Burns, Indra Nooyi, Abigail Johnson, and Andrea Wong, who have all been CEOs and presidents of major institutions, and actually all of them have MIT affiliations, either MIT grad or they sit or have sat in the MIT corporation. So these are all amazing women. When you see them, when you hear them speak, you just know they have executive presence. So what is it? It can have many definitions, but I thought there were a couple that could be helpful. It's really about the ability to inspire confidence in your subordinates and your peers, senior leaders, anybody you interact with, that you're capable, you're reliable, and you're a leader with great potential. It's also an amalgam of qualities that really telegraphs and shouts from the mountaintops that you are in charge. Or if you're not in charge, well, you deserve to be. And it's a combination of gravitas, communication, appearance, and a number of other elements that I'll go into in the next page, or actually 2 pages. And why is it important? It's really important for you to be able to lead and influence effectively if you are viewed as an executive, if you are viewed as someone with confidence and capable and can command attention from people. It also positions you in a really good way to gain access to opportunities, whether it be jobs, investments, new networks, whatever it might be, speaking opportunities, other types of, awards and opportunities. If you become known as someone with executive presence and really all the capabilities that underpin that, it really just opens up opportunities for you. And it really can dramatically improve impact in all aspects of life. And it could be in your personal life, it could be in anything, volunteering, whatever it is you do, as a parent, as a child, as a sibling, friend, having the elements of executive presence, all of which are important, I believe, to succeed in life, can really help with all of these things. So what do we mean by this? Let's have some examples. I found a great article written by Jun Medela in a business, or I forget which business journal this was, but I thought it summarized really well some of the elements that people identify with when you think of executive presence. So one is composure, and this is self-awareness and appropriately controlling your emotions. And what I mean by appropriately is it's okay to get angry. It's okay to get excited. It's okay to be emotional. But it's about appropriately demonstrating these emotions in the context of what makes sense for that situation. I've seen some of the best leaders get really fired up and really angry about something, about some injustice, about something that needs to be fixed. But that anger can actually be effective. It's not uncontrolled anger. It's not uncontrolled emotion. So it's really that feeling of you're in control of your emotions and you're calm, even in the midst of a crazy situation. There might be something happening at your company or something, and it's nerve-wracking. Everybody's worried about it, but you're calm. Confidence. There are elements that involve both physical demeanor, but also vocal demeanor. So good posture. If you're talking to people in a room, keeping eye contact, not glazing over people, but actually looking at people, talking to them. And then having that strong voice, not wavering voice. Oops, I went ahead. Connection. How you engage with people. Are you really communicating authentically? You can be extremely authentic and be a leader, very open. You can be vulnerable. Do people really trust you? Do you have that connection with people? Credibility is a key one. If you're going to be speaking about something or engaging in a meeting, knowing your subject, being able to speak confidently about it, being able to answer questions about it, and being very careful about how you articulate. I think we all get into the, it's actually not that hard to train yourself to get out of that, and it can have a big impact. Charisma. It's a je ne sais quoi. How do you even describe charisma? It's one of those things where you know it when you see it. But a key part of that is, are you a good listener? And at the same time, are you someone people want to listen to? Do you have a vision? Are you enthusiastic? Are you the type of person that draws people to you for a good reason, not a showy reason, but a really genuine reason? You're interested in people, you have interesting things to say. Clarity. When you speak about something, is it very clear or is it obfuscated? Is it obscure? Is it ambiguous? You want to try to train yourself so that when you're communicating something, it's very clear what you mean. And you want to do it with as few words as possible. So, what about when you're not in the room? Executive presence is not just about what happens when you're in a meeting or interacting with people, but how people think about you when you're not in the room. So, rightfully or wrongfully, perception is reality. And we're going to talk about this a little bit when we get into the panel. You might think you come across a certain way, but you'd be very surprised that in many cases you don't. Or maybe certain people have seen you in a situation and they have a different perception of you than you would like them to have. It's very important, even early in your career, and this helped me a lot, to be very, very open to feedback and seek it. How do people perceive you? Why they perceive you that way? And it's not about being shallow or wanting to be seen a certain way. It's about making sure that people see the real you and what you can bring to the table and contribute. And it's important to work on that. And in order to have that perception match the reality, you also need to be a great and consistent performer in everything you do and bring your A game to every interaction. I don't care if this is your first job and you're not a manager, a director, a VP, you can still bring your A game to every meeting and you can still do it with executive presence. And importantly, when you're not in the room, the people who are in the room need to be championing you. So building relationships with peers, mentors, sponsors, and champions, and happy to go into this a little bit later if there's questions about the difference between those. But building relationships with people who can advocate for you at various stages of your career, whether they're in your company or not, are really important. These people can also give you advice about your executive presence and your impact. So we talked a little bit about, what's important from a substance or a style perspective, but I thought it'd be fun to add a tip, a very quick tip that can help you very quickly in a specific situation. And many of you, if not most or all of you, may have seen this because she's become quite well known. But Amy Cuddy, who's a professor at Harvard, has built a whole body of work around a number of aspects of communication and executive presence. But she became really well known a few years ago for the power pose. So what is a power pose? It's a series of poses where that can actually change how you feel and how you come across. So up here we see on the top high power poses where you're laid back, you're standing with your hands on your waist or you're leaning forward. And a low power pose, you're kind of you're very, very inward and you're dejected and you're kind of slumped. Well, it turns out that this can actually change not only how you feel, but also it can change your body chemistry. So studies have shown that just 2 minutes of a high power pose can actually increase your testosterone levels and lower your cortisol levels. So in fact, you can actually increase your confidence and feelings of power and lower your stress in just 2 minutes with this simple trick. So what she recommends is if you have to walk into an important meeting or an interview, find somewhere, go in a bathroom stall, go somewhere and do a power pose for 2 minutes. And it could have dramatic impact on how you feel in that next interaction, which can then snowball from there in a positive way. So I thought in case you hadn't already heard of this, fun tip that we'd mention this. So without further ado, I would love to hand it off to our fabulous panelists. And we're going to start, I'm going to stop sharing here and we're going to focus starting with Andrea.
Oh, it's Andrea, and you had it right when we did
Sorry,
our little prep.
I know.
It's one of those names where there's many ways to say it.
Yeah.
So I am Andrea Leswick, and I'm a big fan of power posing. I actually do it before I speak. I'm terrified of public speaking, but I force myself to do it because I know it's really good for me. But I always do power posing first. So a little bit about me. Like Grace, I studied chemical engineering as an undergraduate. Fun fact, my Europe instructor was the wife of Grace's PhD advisor, so small world. Ultimately, I switched to linguistics, which is what I got my bachelor's in. And then I also got a master's at MIT in linguistics, doing a joint program with the cognitive science department. I do none of that now. I moved into the software industry and I've done everything from product documentation as a technical writer to localization. I've done site reliability and production engineering. And now I am what we call these days an operator. My team is responsible for the operations of our entire technology and products org at Salesforce. So, and in my spare time, I have a husband and a teenage daughter. And then I'm also a big advocate, like Grace, for women and advancing women. I'm a mentor and judge for Technovation. I'm on the IT Advisory Council of Room to Read, which promotes literacy and girls' education around the world. And I started the Salesforce Women's Network at Salesforce.
Thank you so much. Such an amazing background. And it is a small world in the world of MIT that we have that connection. I'd like to invite Parul now to give her career story.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Parul Samani, and I graduated from MIT for undergrad in the class of 2004 after studying course 6-2, electrical engineering and computer science, and minoring in course 14, economics. I then joined Bain & Company as a management consultant, spent 3 years in their Boston office, during which time I also got married. And then about 2 months after getting married, pieced out and moved to India to help start Bain's first Delhi office. I then went to business school at Harvard for 2 years and rejoined Bain for another 4 years across their New York and then San Francisco offices, primarily focusing on consumer technology and ultimately private equity work. After all those years in client services, I decided to make the jump into the startup world here in Silicon Valley, wanting to feel like I was part of building something, and joined Weddington Way, a consumer technology company focused on the wedding space, and spent 3 years there until their acquisition by Gap Inc. And during that same time, I went through my own personal health challenges, and so pivoted professionally into the genomics and healthcare space, helping advocate for genetic testing for hereditary cancers. And then after some interest, and that was for Color Genomics, where I led their global B2B2C marketing. And then after some introspection of, what's important to me with my 2 young daughters and what I'm actually passionate about, in 2019, I launched Silver Linings, which is the work that I do today, serving as a storyteller and thought partner to organizations, helping champion resilience and helping people and organizations navigate uncertainty by building their resilience. And I'm glad to be here today and look forward to today's discussion.
Wonderful, thank you. And Dingley, please share your story.
Well, thank you, Grace. Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Graham. I graduated from MIT in 1999, actually, from course 15 and 14, and really spent most of my time at MIT with my bachelor's. But most of the time I spent at MIT was building solar cars. And so when I left MIT, I ended up joining Ford Motor Company, thinking that would be the route of my professional career, was in the auto industry. But while I was there, meeting many different very, very influential mentors who helped me figure out really where my strength was in finance and in investments, and then really pivoted from Ford to Gateway, where I was in charge of of Gateway's financial planning and eventually leading to Gateway's acquisition by Acer. And then leaving Gateway, and I remember the CFO of Gateway telling me that you really need to go to business school and become a stock analyst. And so that was the best piece of advice I ever had. So I went to business school, went back to MIT, got my MBA in 2006, came out and became a stock analyst. And so from there, I've basically been in investments ever since. I've been a public stock analyst for all of Asia, for small cap growth, pivoting to hedge funds, doing long short investing, to then doing fixed income investing, and most recently, before my current job, managing a $3 billion portfolio of leveraged loans in Denver. But in 2019, my husband, who's actually also an MIT grad, decided he wanted to contribute to society and decided to join a leadership position in San Francisco General Hospital. And Grace actually looking at pulmonary, working in the pulmonary division. And I decided to quit my job and come out to San Francisco. And when I came out, really wanted to do something more impactful with my life after working for essentially Wall Street for over a decade. And now work at New Island Capital, which is an impact investment firm. And I manage about $1 billion of impact-only assets, looking at the public markets, but also doing private investment, especially VC debt. And so happy to discuss with anyone who's interested or who is involved in investments, but also looking forward to sharing my experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love hearing about all of your stories and backgrounds. So without further ado, we're going to jump into a discussion. And I'd like to start with Andrea with a question. Why is executive presence important for one's career? And at what stage does it especially become critical?
So, I mean, I think you did a great job with those slides at the beginning around what executive presence is and why it's so important. I mean, as you advance in your career, whether you become, a people manager or you're a consultant or an individual contributor who has to influence across teams, you want to come across as someone that people have confidence in, that people feel is a capable person that they can trust. And your ability to communicate, your ability to influence others, all of that comes partly from your executive presence. And so that's why it's so important for your career. I think executive presence is perhaps a bit of a misnomer because it's not just for executives, right? You want to have it at every stage of your career, and it varies as you go up. I'll tell you a short story, and it is about appearance, which I think is, and it's not just my opinion, appearance is one of the least important factors of executive presence. A lot of people will tell you that, it's so important, but it's one of the least important factors. So a close friend and colleague of mine, she was a technical product manager, very, very competent. She was the Target jeans and Birkenstocks, technical person. And she got to a point in her career where she wasn't advancing anymore. And she finally, sat down with a mentor and said, "Why am I not advancing?" And this man, thankfully gave her some very direct feedback. He said, "The way you're dressed does not inspire confidence in people. At the next level, you need to be in front of customers. People are not going to send you in front of customers in your Birkenstocks and your Target jeans." So, she took this to heart, but she also didn't want to, not be true to herself. So she found a way to really up level. She still has comfortable shoes. She has much nicer jeans. And, she found a way to have, colorful scarves that will dress up any outfit, right? So she still has her kind of down to earth style, but it's at a much higher level. And that gave people more confidence that they could send her out to talk to customers and put her in those sorts of situations.
That's a great story. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you kind of got to the crux of it, which is we call it executive presence. And I think that's probably because historically, people who reach those executive levels, one reason they got there is because they have executive presence. But it shouldn't only be for executives. I think that's a misnomer. And I think teaching better communication skills, teaching influencing people skills, that can start at any time of life, right? And I think people, as you alluded to, people have a better chance of ascending, if you will, and having more influence if they're able to harness those skills and use them to their advantage. Dingley, can you give examples of where you leveraged executive presence to particular advantage?
Sure. Thank you, Grace. So when I looked at the questions list and Grace gave me this question, I was actually thinking today what would be a good example. And I think the one that I'd like to share is recently, actually just in the last week, I've been having conversations with a nonprofit that's really hoping to deploy capital and help finance African American students who are going to college. And for those of you who are unaware, the graduation rates for African American students are significantly lower than all other minority groups, and really serves as a continuing divide for income generation for that group. And so in my current capacity, one of the things we want to do is to find solutions to those types of problems that we see, and really seek social justice and trying to narrow the divide. And so the nonprofit that I was talking to was extremely disorganized, but the board members were made of very, very high profile people, including ex-heads of federal agencies. And so I find myself talking on this, on these Zoom calls every week with these predominantly white men who are in their 60s or 70s, who've had very long and powerful careers, and who obviously think that they know a lot. But the one thing that they really didn't know a lot was the capital markets. And so I think for me, it was figuring out how to find the one place that I can add value as an executive, so I can bring myself to their level and I can share my expertise. And so in some ways, it's very much like serving as a consultant, but we have gotten to a point where I feel that they really genuinely take in what I have to say, especially since I'm, providing part of the capital, obviously. So leveraging that as well, and being able to have equal voice at the table in terms of how this organization will evolve. And I certainly think a lot of that has to do with presenting myself well, presenting myself with credibility, being very calm, and at the same time, really coming with a level of respect such that it is generating respect from them towards me as well.
That's a great example. And I think you highlight a really important point that we alluded to earlier, which is that level of connection and the listening, right? And really having people feel like they're being heard is actually a big part of it. So that's great. And Parul, can you talk about what aspects of executive presence have come to you naturally versus others that you've had to consciously work at through your career?
Sure. When I think of the slide that you showed of the different elements that compose executive presence, the two that stand out to me that have come more naturally are around confidence and communication skills. But when I break that down and think about what I've had to work on over the years, it's the elements around authenticity and listening that you mentioned. And what I mean by that is, in high school, I was a very competitive, sort of player in the speech and debate world. And that has its pros and cons, right? I built confidence and I learned strong communication skills as a debater, but I also learned it in a certain style, which is like you go into presentation mode and, it's not necessarily as authentic or as showing a vulnerability as one might require. And when I think about opportunities I've had to learn this about myself as well as improve it, an experience that comes to mind actually occurred at MIT. I don't know if any others participated in this, but MIT used to hold a conference, and maybe still does, a leadership retreat for students called Leadership, or the Leadership Institute, that still exists today. And I attended as a student, and we did one of those group activities where you're tasked with a set of materials that you need to figure out how to prioritize using in case of, a big earthquake or something like that. And I naturally went into leader mode and was like helping direct the conversation because we were being timed, and it was, important to get this list put together and submitted. And I got the feedback afterwards that, it's great that you stepped into this leadership role, but you do realize you got it all wrong, right? Like the answers were just all wrong in terms of what I ultimately collected this group to deliver. And it was because I was driving towards a result and an outcome, but I wasn't stepping back and asking the group, okay, does anyone here actually have experience with earthquakes or scouts training, or might actually know what the answers to this might be? And it's lessons in life along the way that helped me learn the importance of not just going into speech and debate mode, but being able to step back and listen. And sometimes you can best lead a group and lead a conversation by actually asking the right questions. And in the work that I do now, which is serving as a public speaker, but on topics like resilience and mental well-being, it's been incredibly important for me to learn how to tap into my authenticity and put more of my vulnerability, out on the table, to be effective in terms of the impact that I want to have on the world. And so there's definitely elements of executive presence that can come naturally to people, but there are a lot that can also just be learned. And part of the process is identifying where your own strengths and weaknesses are and which ones you want to focus on developing.
That's a great story. And thanks for sharing kind of your vulnerability and sort of recognizing, what wasn't going to be working for you going forward. And I can relate to it because I did Model UN in high school and I loved it. But you're right, it's a completely different style. I also did a lot of theater at MIT, actually. And I think theater helped me a lot with executive presence. I did about 15 plays. You're going to wonder when I did my PhD work, but I did a lot of theater at MIT. So let's move on to a question I'd like to ask all of you, which is, and this is interesting, and it kind of addresses a little bit of what Pearl was just talking about. So Andrea, have you ever received any specific constructive feedback on executive presence? I mean, you gave the example of your colleague and the way she was dressed, but has anybody, a mentor or someone, given you some constructive feedback that you found helpful that you could share?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also did a lot of theater at MIT. So Grace, I feel like we need to connect.
We have to
after this.
I'm doing online theater now, by the way. Let's connect.
Oh my gosh. That's so cool. I got some feedback that I was coming across as very defensive. And, this I think speaks to and I see people posting in the chat over here, what were the 7 components of executive presence? I think this really speaks to the area around clarity as well as credibility and charisma. I think sort of all in there, and I'll tell you why. So I got feedback that I was coming across as defensive. And in my mind, I was just, explaining, my point of view. I was giving context. I was trying to help people kind of see my point of view. And the part of executive presence that's really important is having the self-awareness of, how you're reacting in a situation, having the awareness of others, and just taking a pause to, really kind of feel what's going on, and then start to listen and ask questions. And I had an example recently where my team told me, this other executive is not going to give us headcount. He said, no way is he giving us any resources to help with this project. And so my initial reaction was to like go into this meeting and be like, you need to give us, resources. We're doing this work for you. You have to. And interestingly, I had recently kind of just on a whim done the master class course on negotiations from this FBI master negotiator. I love masterclass. And so I started to use some of the techniques in there, some of them which are really about executive presence, deeply listening, asking questions. And that's what I did. I didn't try to say, you need to give us anything. I didn't try to say anything about the work that we were doing for this person. I just asked him questions. And I ended up having him fund the project for me. And so I could have gone in there very defensive about, him not giving us what we needed. Instead, I went in actively listening, asking questions, and it got me what I wanted.
That is a great story. And some of the people I admire the most, my chief operating officer at my company, who I've worked with for many years, and I hugely admire, is a phenomenal listener. And he excels at, when he has his direct reports and his group, he never tells them what to do. He sits down and asks them, what do you think needs to happen here? I mean, he might have an answer. He might know how he might want to solve a problem or a challenge, but he doesn't tell them. He draws it out, and in the process, they learn more from the questions he's asking, and they also feel empowered, and they look up to him as a great leader. So it's a win-win, right? And you just gave the perfect example of how you went in and used that technique, and it worked for you. So that's a great example of connection and influence. So thank you for sharing that. Dingley, can you talk about that? Have you been given a specific feedback or something, or learned something that you could share, something that was an aha moment?
Sure. I think I want to try to find something that might be slightly different than Andrea's examples, partially because I think a lot of graduates of MIT have similar examples of just really trying to prove that we are right. What I find in my line of work is I sit between the customers who are the clients of my investments. They're putting their money with me, and I'm the fiduciary, right? And then the investees. And I would say one of the things I find is being concise, taking one of the C's, is extremely important. Trying to tell your customers every single investment and how you came up to this, amazing conclusion that this is the most amazing investment ever, really doesn't actually resonate. What really resonates is your ability to show confidence, your ability to show that you have composure and you are with it and you know what's going on, but explaining it in a way that they kind of see the big picture and that they understand. And so I do find understanding your audience and being able to talk to them in a really concise manner to be very important. And that was the feedback I had probably for many years, especially in my years as a stock analyst, as a younger stock analyst, where it was difficult, I think, for the marketing team to put me in front of clients, because I kind of just go so in depth and I lose my audience engagement and attention. So it's something that I've really worked on.
That's a great example. And I've had to practice that in pitching to investors because I've done a lot of fundraising. And my chairman gave me the best advice once on this, which is you answer the question in as short of, concise way as possible. And you don't go into the second and third level detail unless they ask. And my chief medical officer sometimes does that because he's so enthusiastic, and he'll go on and go 3 levels down when you don't really need to. So you leave them wanting more, right? Let them ask more information rather than providing it. So that's a great example. So thank you for that. So Parul, do you want to, I know you shared a little bit. I love the way you shared your story of self-awareness, of those things you had to work on. Did you ever have someone give you feedback that surprised you, like beyond those areas and then you said, oh, I didn't realize I was doing that, and actually that's really helpful?
Yeah, so there's two that come to mind actually. One was during a PD chat, or like a professional development chat, with a manager when I was at Bain. And I remember him saying that the only feedback he had for me, which in hindsight, I'm like, okay, that's actually like not so bad, but it was a good, it was a good learning opportunity, because I was not at all aware that, this was something that I do, or that it may bother people. But he said that when I'm listening, and and he or somebody else is talking, that I would acknowledge what I'm hearing by saying, uh-huh. I'd be like, uh-huh, right? And in my mind, that's just a way of acknowledging the listening that's happening. But he indicated that that could be disruptive to the person, and so now I'm more of like a silent nodder, to indicate that I'm engaging in the conversation. So that was definitely like an unexpected piece of feedback that, if it helps in communication and interactions and in future conversations, then I'm happy to have heard it. But one specific piece of feedback that I think applies to business leaders, or especially people in a work environment as they are transitioning from lower level roles to higher level roles, is one that I was given while I was at Bain and Company. Because since I had joined, as in that analyst position out of undergrad, but then stayed on for so many years into the manager role, there's a lot of evolution that I had to do in my own personal style, and interactions and meetings, to reposition myself from being a committed individual contributor to a thought leader who can manage a team. And the piece of feedback that I was given is, I was in a meeting with the partner on the team, and I was still in that kind of analyst mindset where I had my paper out, my pen, and as she was speaking, I was just diligently taking notes, right? Except I'm not an analyst anymore. Now I'm like in promotion window to be a manager. And yet I was still just sitting there taking notes, as if I'm just going to execute what I'm being told. And she immediately stopped me and gave me the feedback to not just write down everything that she says, but to actually just be listening, and only then write down later what might be like an action item or something, but to engage in conversation. Because writing down the notes of what's being told to me is not an executive level behavior. It's like the junior note taker behavior. Whereas if I'm just listening and then asking questions or engaging in dialogue back and forth with my own point of view, and then only writing things down later, then I'm now positioning myself as more senior, as more of a thought partner to her as I'm looking to rise in the organization.
That is a great example. I hope everybody's writing down some of these tips, because all kidding aside, I do think hopefully what you're hearing a lot from the panel is that sometimes what may seem to be small things can make a big difference in terms of how you ask questions and how you interact in a meeting. They signal, it's like a secret signal to someone of your position and your ability to contribute. So I think we've had a lot of great tips on that.
And Grace, if I could just,
sure.
please. Oh, sorry. I think the other thing that has been sort of common through all of these is feedback, whether it's solicited or unsolicited. You can't work on executive presence by yourself. You need to seek out that feedback. I mean, and ask people, how are you being perceived? How can you change? How can you improve?
That's exactly right. And Parul, having been at McKinsey for a few years, I know Bain's very similar. That's one of the best things they do, is they have a strong feedback culture. And that's probably something we could recommend to everybody, is how do you take that feedback? Take it with an open mind. To this day, my first reaction when someone gives me feedback is thank you. And sometimes they're surprised, because sometimes the feedback is not so, it's a little bit hard sometimes. And that's my automatic response. It's like, thank you so much. And they're like, oh, wow, I thought you were going to be upset. So take it as a gift. Take feedback as a gift. It's always a gift. So for each of you as well, and you've given some great anecdotes. Now I want to a really exciting one where you had an aha moment where you got, gosh, I finally got it? I mean, you've all had it for a long time, but was there one meeting, one presentation, one customer interaction where you just suddenly felt different, that things had sort of come together and you sort of felt your executive presence was at a new level? And then what impact did they have? So Andrea, do you have a story like that? Is there some memorable moment like that?
You know, I'm sure it'll come to me like when you go to somebody else.
Oh, sure.
I have to say that I don't think there's any like one moment, because I do feel like it's always an evolution, like that I can always get better at executive presence. And, I do remember, one moment I had where I was able to present at our annual user conference, and working with a speaking coach on that. And just there was that moment after I was done where I just felt like, oh my gosh, like I did my power poses, I had all the right eye contact, and really, really brought it for that presentation. Yeah.
It was probably a really good feeling, right?
Yeah, it was an amazing
felt it all
feeling.
coming together. That's awesome.
But I do feel like it's an evolution. Like there's no moment that you get it and then you don't have to work on it anymore. Like you can always improve.
Absolutely. So Parul, with that in mind, I absolutely agree. It's definitely an evolution, but I guess I was sort of thinking about it as a big step change. Like, was there a moment where you got up to here, and of course there's still always room. So do you have a similar story like that, Parul?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts come to mind. One is the essence of executive presence, and what it represents is this feeling of having established credibility, right? Having built the trust of the people around you, whether that's your direct reports or your supervisors, and or just the network that you're surrounded by. And one example of that moment where it felt like, oh, I did it, whether I definitely wasn't thinking of it as like, oh, I have established executive presence. Like I wasn't thinking of it in that way. But that, there's this time when I was in my early years at Bain working on a private equity case. And, those are like intense, no mercy type situations. And, I was like the most junior person on the team. And I was sitting in the conference room. We were on a conference call with the client, and I was in the most junior role. So I'm not necessarily the presenter or like the manager or the partner that's leading the client discussion. And yet, as the most junior person, I was the one who was most familiar with the data, right? I'm the one who had been doing all the number crunching and actual slide making and familiar with that content. And there was a point in the presentation where a question was asked that the manager and partner just clearly like did not know how to respond. And you can't just like not respond to a private equity client, right? And they look around the table, and I'm like I think I know this, and they're like, all right, jump in. And I just grounded myself in the expertise that I brought in that specific case, which was familiarity with the numbers, and I was able to speak eloquently enough to answer the question. And the team was just like, high-fiving me because we're on a conference call. And so the client can't see it. And they were just like, oh, like, great job because you like saved us. And it's an experience like that, where now in hindsight, I think of that as being a baby step towards having started to build and establish my executive presence, even as such a junior person, because it ultimately came down to having confidence, having communication skills, and having been able to build credibility.
That's a great, yeah. Great example.
For this conversation, though, it is continually evolving, and it does continue to look so different throughout your career and the paradigm in which you're trying to establish credibility. And I would say that now I feel like starting from scratch and building silver linings to pivot my own career from being like this business leader to now being someone who can be, is hired to like serve as the voice of patient and caregivers, or speak to how to build personal resilience. Like that to me personally feels like a win in my own journey in developing my executive presence, because it actually involved in some ways starting from scratch, right? Like breaking into a space that I wasn't necessarily in before, establishing trust and credibility with the ecosystem of players in that. And that was a whole different level of challenge for me in executive presence building than, in the roles I had had before.
Great. No, this is very, very helpful. Thank you so much for sharing. Dingley, do you have a similar story?
Yeah, Grace, I was, taking my time trying to think of a good example that I can share with the group. And I think one of the things that I have really, really struggled with from a composure and executive presence point of view is really being patient and taking pauses. And if I can maybe talk about the word authenticity, and probably one of the key points that maybe enlightening comments that someone had mentioned to me is that we judge ourselves through our intentions, but we judge others through their actions. And I think it's really important to flip that, which is how can you judge others through their intentions and judge yourself through your actions? And this is where the feedback mechanism comes in really, really importantly, because you don't always see yourself through your actions, you see yourself through your intentions. And so it's something that I've really practiced on. And I think the first time I saw real results was I would take steps back when I negotiate with funds or with managers, etc., and really take a step back and say, we're not ready for a decision. Do it in a really composed manner and really just kind of, I wouldn't say hang up on them, but really take a long pause to allow everyone to kind of sit through, because then you really understand who's impatient, who's trying to get the deal. And I had an experience recently, I would say, where that filtered all the way up on the other side on my counterparty to their CEO. And this is a CEO of, over $100 billion market cap company. And in that process, I actually built confidence, realizing that my ability to be patient and really hold these pauses was so important in my ability to negotiate on a rational and reasonable manner and on behalf of my client. And so that was a real key moment, a breakthrough for me to really understand their intention and whether they're just playing hardball or whether they really, really wanted this deal. And I found myself being able to take that tool and move forward.
It's great advice. I think establishing your power through patience and composure and savvy tactics like that is a really important part of it. So thank you for sharing. So I'm looking at the time right now. We have a lot more discussion questions, but I want to make sure that we have a chance to address questions from the audience. So I think for now, what I suggest we do is that we move over to audience questions. So I think, Shalene, you were collecting these. If you want to feed them to us, and then we'll just have